A World Bank report has again ranked South Africa as the most unequal society in the world. The bank's global poverty database, or on their global poverty database, this is part of a report on a commercial and residential property group, Knight Frank, showing that South Africa has produced more millionaires since the start of the pandemic. Let's get some reaction now from Isobel Frye, Director of the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute. Isobel, thank you very much for availing yourself this afternoon. Just help us in terms of understanding how such reports are put together and what is it that they're actually looking at.
Thank you very much. The report that was released was also looking at the inequality within SACU as the customs union. And we know that the countries within SACU, like South Africa, are amongst the most unequal in the world, mostly because the level of extraction and income generation is through primary resources which are extracted and sold abroad, leading to very little employment generation within the country of origin. So the report was quite significant specifically because it came up with a number of recommendations which should be adopted in order to reduce the inequality both within SACU and amongst the countries in SACU itself. I think one of the most critical areas to look at is the huge level of asset inequality. In the report, it shows that in South Africa, 10% of the population actually owns 80% of the financial assets. So in terms of the compilation of the report, we know that various surveys were used and was compiled into a regional index. The issue that, however, does strike me as being something which the World Bank report didn't look at, was really looking at why there should be such high levels of inequality. And we know that with the income generation, basically a lot of the mines in the region are owned by foreign mine owners that do not pay tax to South Africa. So the extraction of minerals and also the extraction of cheap labor without paying due wages is then not even taxed at the country of source, but is taken to the countries where the multinationals themselves are registered.
It also takes a look, you speak of, the economic side of it, it takes a look at unequal land ownership, perpetuating generational poverty.
It does, and what is interesting, because of course the SACU countries are Namibia, Botswana, Lesotho and South Africa, is looking at the settler imprint. So again, all of these countries were colonized, and in South Africa we know that the dispossession of land has not been equalized yet. But it was interesting that in Namibia, in fact, the statistic there is that in Namibia 70% of land is still owned by people of European origin. So not only is the ownership still the imprint of the settler colonizers, but then, as you say, the question of the proper expropriation or exploitation of land. So here we come to a slight tension, I think, that is interesting to think about, because the report recommends that more land is used for commercial agriculture. But we know that for many people, ownership of land is really a home and a place to live. The report was quite scathing about the subsistence level utilization of land. But I think as a country and as a region, we need to be asking to what extent are people entitled to own and keep their own land, but how should people then be linked into a more commercialized mass production at the same time? I think one of the other aspects that came through of interest was the question of how we maximize the primary production of income. So for that, they refer to the wage income, and there's a huge discrepancy that attaches to skills premiums. So for people who have a primary and secondary education but not a tertiary education, there are huge levels of income disparity in terms of wages. So we're not even talking about unemployment there. We're talking about those people who are employed. And in South Africa, we see that very significantly. National minimum wage was introduced in 2020 to really reduce the levels of basic wages that were being handed out to people. And the question is how we're able to improve that premium through improving the educational and skills training.
As you rightfully mentioned, the SACU countries, including Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, Namibia and South Africa, found to be the most unequal. What did it reveal about the other three countries?
I think the question about the inequality in all of the countries was quite striking, where we aren't able to really agree with the findings of the report, is that most of the research that we've done recently at SPI has really argued for a universal social security grant to try and reduce inequality. The report itself actually identifies the social protection schemes that exist in our neighboring countries and criticizes them for the fact that they are universal, suggesting, apart from Namibia, so South Africa and Namibia are the two countries that have targeted schemes. The World Bank report suggests that our neighbors, Eswatini, Botswana and Lesotho, should actually start implementing means tests and reducing the universality of these schemes, which we think is not a very good way of trying to expand the social protection floor that many other development agencies, including the United Nations, are calling for. So I think to that extent we will be engaging with the authors and the World Bank on that level. Where we do see some synergy with the recommendations, however, is their concern that inequalities reduce countries' abilities to generate economic growth. So I think the aspects of trying to reduce inequality needs to be seen not just from a human rights perspective, but from an economic perspective. So how we equalize incomes means that we are therefore being able to invest in the future growth orientation that we're needing to be looking at. I think another major point of concern that we have with the report is that it does not criticize the macroeconomic frameworks under which each of our countries are operating. So what they're trying to say is we need to do different things with limited income. What we're saying is there's no way that our region is going to move into a level of prosperity unless we change those macroeconomic frameworks. We need to be looking at the stimulation of employment through the redistribution of income. We need to be looking at the redistribution of ownership of land and assets. And we need to be looking at ways in which we can generate better premiums for education and healthcare, rather than just trying to reduce their expenditure. How do we limit the difference between public and private by ensuring that everybody is well fed, well nourished? I think just one of the concerns that I had about the report is it was looking at the question of stunting, and we know, Dudu, that stunting is an equivalency, or it's a proxy test for poverty. So where children are stunted, it means that they're not getting enough nutrition in their early years. Now, the recommendation that linked directly to the stunting was basically improving the healthcare and access to healthcare. So there's a slight disjuncture in terms of our analysis of the real causes of we agree on the fact that the outcomes are bad, stunting is bad, but for us it's an indication that households are too poor to feed the children, rather than the fact that clinics are not there to provide palliative care once stunting itself has been identified.
I do wonder, though, Isobel, this report reveals nothing that we do not know about ourselves, particularly because we see these problems that you have mentioned and outlined playing themselves out. Just today, personnel at Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital, one of the biggest in Southern Africa, taking to the streets because they even have gotten to a point where they have to buy patients food. Movements on the ground where people are fighting amongst each other because they feel like South Africa does not work for South Africans. Will we then be sitting a number of years down the line as if you and I are privileged to still be around, or will this conversation still be the same, that we have so many reports and so many recommendations? South Africa does not lack in policy. It lacks in implementation. Maybe that's what some people would definitely believe.
Dudu, I think you've really identified quite a tragic weakness on our behalf, and I think it comes down to the question of what kind of country and what kind of values we collectively have. Yesterday, Stats SA released a subjective poverty report, which, as you say, said nothing new. We have the data, we've had the empirical data for the last 20 years that have suggested that nothing significantly has changed on a socioeconomic, not a political, socioeconomic level from apartheid times for the majority of people. We still have people with no access to land or assets. We've got a shrinking productive economy and a growing financialization of our economy, which really talks to the taking out of profits and the reintegration into productive kinds of factories. And that we have a leadership that is tasked with finding solutions, real solutions for people on the ground. And yet the only solution that is now being talked about, which is the redistributed basic income grant, is shunned as being something which is unaffordable. What is unaffordable is the fact that today we're starving people in a country which has such high levels of inequality. We hope that the one message that is taken from this SACU inequality report of the World Bank is that interventions need to happen. We cannot rely on the market to trickle down their profits to people in some hoped-for attempt to raise people's incomes. The state has a clear obligation to use its powers to regulate, to tax, and to distribute in a way that we don't see this conversation being one of a few, which leads to absolutely no change at all.
Isobel Frye, I beg your pardon, is
Frye.
Director of the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute. Thank you for availing yourself this afternoon.
Thank you, Dudu.